Hi everyone, it's the 17th of April, and as we sit here, being a Friday, thinking that maybe we're only less than a week now from going down from level 4 lockdown to level 3, though from what I can understand, it doesn't sound like there's a huge amount of relief in that. A few changes for schooling, a few changes for some food delivery services, but as far as gatherings are concerned, it sounds like they'll still be very strict on those. So no real sign anywhere in the near future where we'd be able to gather like normal. And so obviously reflecting on what that might mean for us going forward for a few more, well, who knows, weeks, months, we don't know what we're talking about here. The news out of Singapore is very interesting because, of course, that was I suppose, an example we were looking to in modelling our own response and going early and going hard, as they love to say. Something similar to what Singapore had done, and yet they have recently gone through a series of spikes, quite high numbers of new cases coming in. So it's a little uncertain, certainly. We can be certain of uncertainty. We don't know what COVID-19 might do and really how to manage a virus. It seems simple. Let's just cut the transmission process and it'll die, and yet maybe it's not as simple as it sounds. We won't know, and we can't go forward with any great certainty as far as what the future may hold, but we can trust in some things. And of course, what I've been trying to reflect on throughout the whole journey is the faithfulness of God and His call on our lives to be faithful as well. And that doesn't look like knowing exactly what the future is going to hold tomorrow, the next day, etc., but a much bigger sense of what the future will hold. We cannot have any guarantees in this life other than that there will be trouble, there will be difficulties, and that God will be with us. So I'm thinking about one person in particular. I don't want to use your name, but you've got a bad back, and have moved in with someone else, a close friend, to be cared for, because while you have had this approval for a surgery, they're not going ahead with that while COVID-19 is sort of locking everything down. And I'm just really holding you in prayer at the moment, as I'm sure many others are. I just don't want to use your name for this fact this is a public podcast and you haven't given permission. But just so that you know that you're in many people's prayers and we are thinking of you. And we hope that the pain is receding, and it's certainly a prayer, and that you'll be able to have the surgery sooner rather than later. So there are real issues, and I'm very much aware of that in this lockdown, even as many of us are coping reasonably well. Though speaking of coping, I'd have to say that this last week has been a bit of a trial. It feels like it's dragging, and for some reason not sleeping particularly well. And sometimes things just get on top of you. You feel like everything's gone fine, and then for no particular reason you wake up and it just seems a bit gloomier. Maybe it's partly the weather, and maybe it's just the fact of being many days locked in the same house with the same people, and not being able to see my friends and to see you. Those breaks in relationship, they are painful, and as much as we can connect still online and over the phone, it's not the same. So just carrying that a little bit, not really down, just a bit weary of it, if you know what I mean. Just a little bit like, the four walls were once comforting and now they're a little restrictive. So it's a bit like that, and maybe it's the same for you. So anyway, I want to do a brief reflection on Revelation, the seventh seal on the scroll breaking. And what happens next. And it's really only a few verses that we're reflecting on in chapter 8, the first few verses of chapter 8. And it's a sort of a strange passage. Even as I mentioned in the last vlog, the flow of Revelation at this point had been building and building and building, these horrors coming up to some sort of climax, and then this great pause where other action took place before we got to this last seal. And then when the seal is broken, it feels again anticlimactic. Little happens. In fact, we move on to the next vision sequence, or at least that begins to interlock with the previous one. The seventh seal is broken, and then we are introduced to seven trumpets that are handed to seven angels. and we're not sure yet what that's about. Though the imagery itself is quite kind of clear that it's really about announcing now what is on the scroll. So there's no real kind of climactic horror that comes with the seventh seal. In fact, it's like a handing over to the next part. The scroll is now officially open, but we're not going to get to read it or hear what is on the scroll until these 7 trumpets sound. And of course, ceremonially trumpets were used to announce things, to even announce, a war, or you sound the trumpet when you're about to go into battle to throw fear into the heart of the enemy, or you would sound trumpets when there is the coming of a regal personage. Trumpets were used to declare major events. So we're the sense of anticlimax in a way is because nothing really happens other than to say something else is about to happen. And then there's silence in heaven for half an hour, it says. So a relatively short period of time, but definitely silence, compared with the scene that we were introduced to in chapter 4, this massive throne room with thunder and lightning and crying out angels and strange beasts and the constant worship of the elders. It goes dead silent. And then the final scene, or part of the scene, is the prayers of the saints and those who are offered up as incense to God. So there's a time of prayer and silence and reflection. So kind of a strange ending, but I want to give a couple of thoughts that obviously. The first is, it seems anticlimactic, but I think the intention is the opposite to that. I think it's about building the tension. Think of it this way, great thrillers, if you know a great thriller, perhaps you have a favourite, they're built on trying to resist getting to the action too quickly. For instance, the classic Jaws, the movie about that shark. The interesting thing about that, just as a side note, is they had this robot shark they were trying to build, but it's delay and delay and delay before they could get to complete it, to get it to the shoot. But they couldn't stop the movie. They were committed to shooting the movie, so they had to shoot without the shark. And in fact, that was almost the making of the movie, because it was this lurking threat that we only saw hints and signs to. We knew it was there, but we never really saw it, or we would see glimpses of it. It was the presence of the threat that never really kind of came to the fore that built the tension. So our imaginations were brought to play, and we could imagine this terrible shark about to do terrible danger, some terrible act at any point, and the fact that it didn't, we were waiting and waiting. So it was the building anticipation. It was the worst thing. So it was actually a real benefit to the movie and its building of tension as a thriller, that it took ages for the robot shark to be completed, and because when it finally did get to the scenes and be the central part of the movie, the action was over and we were kind of relieved. We could see it now, and it was a little bit comic. An older movie, and from the great thriller director Hitchcock, Birds. I don't know if you've seen Birds. In the end, of course, they do attack, and that's kind of frightening. But more frightening still was the scene when these birds are congregating, and they're in large numbers on the houses and the playgrounds and on the power lines, and these people walking through this eerie scene where all these birds are just sitting there quietly watching them. Now, birds sitting quietly watching you isn't that terrifying, but the numbers that were there, and of course the implication that these birds represented a threat, the fact that they didn't do anything and you're waiting and waiting, and as Hitchcock played out this tension, he was a master at bringing the tension, building the tension, to the point that you were just begging him to do something, let the tension break. And of course the satisfaction when finally something does happen, and then the movie rolls on and is drawn to a conclusion. Because of course once the action breaks for a thriller, it's basically over. And added to that now, of course, is the music. behind all of those scenes, the fact that you know that the birds are a threat, is almost entirely up to the music, or the music plays a huge part. If you took the music out of a movie, it'd be very hard to work out what the scenes were meant to evoke in you. It's one thing to shoot it well, but it's another thing to have the music that grabs your attention. A friend of mine actually commented, he said, if you were to make a decision between a really big screen, beautiful screen that would show a movie beautifully, but really tinny speakers, or a small screen, but amazing sound, always go for the amazing sound, because you adjust, your eyes adjust to the screen, and it doesn't become that much of a big difference. You become immersed in the story and you forget too much what you're looking at. But the music, the sound, if the sound is awful, you can't stand it. You tend to walk away. But if the sound is amazing, it immerses you into the story. So not only does a thriller, of course, use that brilliantly, all movies do, but I think, in fact, that's part of what the trumpets are doing in the story of Revelation. Now, we're not familiar with the sound of trumpets. It's not part of our heritage and our culture. If someone were to declare by 7 trumpets announcement from Jacinda Ardern, I think we'd all be a little bit bemused and feel that maybe she was a little bit stuck up. It doesn't evoke the same kind of emotion in us as it does when Revelation was being written. But for them, of course, it did evoke lots of the feelings of awe and dread and a sense of magnitude. And so the soundtrack has been introduced before we get to the words, before we get to what is on the scroll. There's a soundtrack introduced, which heightens the tension. So what I think is happening in this scene is not anticlimactic, but the building of tension. We want to get to the words on the scroll, but we've been held back from that, so that anticipation builds. We want to know what is on the scroll. Well, we need a soundtrack first, so that we come to this with a sense of anticipation building in us, a sense of please, anything. We just want to know what's on there. So cleverly done, I think, if you understand the literary approach that has been taken here. Now, the silence and prayer. I think there's a couple of things coming in here. Now, as you've probably noted, I'm not normally lost for words, but there are a few occasions in which I am, and they normally are one of two things. They're either moments of great grief or suffering or kind of horror, or something terrible has happened, and I am lost for words, and I'm sure this is familiar for you too. But the other one is the opposite of that, something wonderful, something so outrageously good, something that strikes the tongue numb, because you can't put words to what is so amazing. So those two extremes are often about the only context in which you'll find me unable to speak. And I think that both are present in this moment as the 7th seal is broken and the trumpets are handed out and the silence falls. I think we're called to remember the grief. Remember the scripture that says, God would that none would perish. So God doesn't want anyone to die, anyone to perish. He doesn't want anyone to be lost to evil. And what we've seen so far in the first 6 seals in these apocalyptic scenes is horror and death and destruction. And there's a silence in heaven that I think reflects that God is not happy with this. This is not God's heart. This is not God's intent. This is not God's desire to see anyone perish. He would that none would perish. So there's a silence here that echoes the grief of God as the evil destroyer goes about doing what the evil destroyer does. And a reminder, in fact, of the story of Job. As you know, Satan is given license to make his life a torment, not to take his life, but he's given license to torment him. And his life becomes a nuclear wasteland. His family's gone. All his riches are gone. He is left with nothing. His health is gone. He is such a wreck. And his 3 friends make a pact to go and find him and comfort him. And when they first see him, they don't recognize him. And then they begin to wail, and they tear their clothes, and they throw dust on their head. And they sit with him in silence for 7 days and 7 nights. And of course, the number seven is evocative of a kind of the right amount of time. It's at the perfect time. And of course, as the seventh seal is broken, there's a silence as well. And I think there's a solidarity of grief going in here. There's nothing in heaven that would celebrate the destruction on earth. Nothing. There's no reason to celebrate it. It's horror and it's sad and it's grief. And the act of silence is a solidarity of all people and all things that want good to win. To sit in silence is about the only thing you can really say in such a time. But there's also a silence of awe and wonder. And as I said last time, the story was building toward this climactic horror scene. It has been bad enough to that point, and it was surely going to get worse. And yet there's a pause in the process in which, after the 6 seals are broken, there's a seal from God to protect and preserve. And so the story starts to go back the other way. It goes from horror to hope. And we see at the end of that scene, in this pause in the action between the 6th and 7th seal, is this outbreak of worship as a multitude, a numberless number of people from every tribe and tongue who are preserved and able to stand before God, righteous in their faith in Christ. That this leads to worship, an outpouring of joy. From the multitude, from the elders, from the angels, all of heaven worships the Creator God. And this silence and these prayers, I think what they do, sorry, I don't know why the dog barks, he just seems to go crazy. This silence seems to allow that praise to just ring for a period of time. To have its place as well, to be held hand in hand with the grief. So that's where I want to leave it now. Actually, is to invite you into that space as well. I don't know what it's been like for you the last little while, or as I said, mentioning someone who I know is suffering at the moment. But even in the midst of suffering and grief, I don't want to add words to that or trying to give cheap meaning to it. But I do want to encourage us to, if we can, find that little glimpse of God that might lead us to praise. I was listening to a podcast the other day from a Christian who was a scientist, and he said in his experience, all scientists do pray. And normally it's the prayer of expressions of wonder. He said they do this incredible hard, laborious work, and then occasionally they get these glimpses of the underlying beautiful order of the universe, of all things, and it invokes in them this wonder. Now it's an undirected prayer because they don't know, and perhaps in most cases, or those scientists who have no faith don't know what they're wondering at or where they're handing their wonder to. But I think he's right to say that when we catch glimpses of things, glimpses of a beautiful reality undergirding what seems to be chaotic times, and it strikes in us this wow. I hope there's a wow in your life for the next little while. I hope you find a wow this weekend. I hope you find a wow, a reason to celebrate and to wonder at the mercy of God, who even in the midst of these times, in the midst of your perhaps specific suffering, you'll find the beauty of God who promises and guarantees a future well beyond our imagination. That one that we can, if we can just anticipate a little bit, will lead us to wonder and praise. God bless you. I hope to see you again soon. And God be with you right now.